I'll kick it off just by giving you each a few minutes to give a little bit of an overview on your perspectives. The conversations we've had here today and elsewhere about the future of work always touch on the disruption of higher education. Can each of you talk about how you see educational institutions, credential providers, skills training providers, and employers working together to create change, whether it's increasing accessibility, affordability, developing skills and competencies more related to labor market, or supporting lifelong learning? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to kick us off.
Great.
Sure. When we talk about disruption of higher education, folks have been talking about that for 25 years. I remember back in the late 90s, I started my career in higher education working at Columbia University, and Columbia was under attack by these for-profit companies who were picking off their faculty members in business schools and so forth. And the sense was that technology was going to change the business of higher education. And I agree with you, Wendy, that it's remarkable how little has changed in the past 25 years. Yes, we have millions of students who are taking some courses online, and some are taking entire degree programs online, but the basic structure of the higher education enterprise hasn't changed. I like to say that technology hasn't disrupted higher education directly, but it is actively disrupting it indirectly. And it's disrupting it indirectly because of the nature, because changes in the nature of work, and particularly entry-level jobs, and changes in the nature of hiring. And I'll touch on those both briefly. Your typical entry-level job today is very different from what it was when I graduated from university and when you did. Today, the best way to characterize an entry-level job is you're using some sort of software or SaaS platform to help manage a business function. And our universities today neither train on the SaaS platform nor do they train on the business function. And that's a problem. And the second is that hiring has changed. Every good job that a university graduate might want is posted online, and every online job posting attracts 300, 400, 500 resumes. No single hiring manager or HR manager is going to sort through 500 resumes or applications. They all use applicant tracking systems, which are keyword-based filters, to figure out which ones they're actually going to look at. And so what are these ATS filters? Applicant tracking systems are just looking at keywords in the job description and mapping them to keywords in the resume. And if you don't have sufficient keyword density, you're invisible. You're literally invisible. So over the past decade, what we've seen is that technical or digital skills in job descriptions have come to outnumber all other skills combined across virtually every sector of the economy. And there's a good reason for that and a bad reason for that. The good reason is that these jobs, as I mentioned, are digital, significantly digital. The bad reason, of course, is that there are only so many ways in a job description to say problem solving or critical thinking or communication skills, but you can always add a digital skill to a job description. And so we've over-indexed for digital skills. And so I was laughing at your comments when we hear employers talk about the fact that, the millennials we're trying to hire, they don't have any soft skills. What I say to them is that, well, of course, you're screening out everyone except for those who have the technical skills. And then, those who have the digital skills on their resumes may not have the soft skills you're looking for, but the soft skills are out there. So I'll leave it at that for now.
That's great. Yeah. Over to you, Karen.
So I would build on that to say, when we think about our skills ecosystem in Canada, we have essentially two pillars. The first pillar being the system that serves individuals before they enter the workforce, so our K-12 and our post-secondary. And we've already talked a fair bit this morning about need for innovation within those systems. But when we think about the system overall worldwide, Canada's doing fairly well. There's lots of room for improvement, but we're doing fairly well. We also have a second pillar that's focused on individuals who have entered the workforce, but are exiting because they are unemployed. And we have a whole system across the country of provincially and territorially run employment centers. This system serves primarily individuals who are unemployed. And this system also needs to innovate, but it's reasonably well established. Where we have a real gap in Canada is for individuals who are already working and are at risk of disruption. So we really need, in a rapidly changing labor market, we need a system that can support individuals before they become unemployed. It's extraordinarily inefficient to wait until people are unemployed to provide career advice and guidance on options for training. So I think we really need to think about a third pillar. And I think there's some real opportunity in Canada. And I'm curious, Gladys, to hear your perspective, because this is an area you're really close to. But I think our employment service systems across the country can really play a role in this and really become hubs of career advice and guidance, right? Using really high quality labor market information to provide guidance to Canadians from all walks of life, not just when they're unemployed, but when they want to make those career transitions. And to really do this and do this well is going to take a massive investment, and we're going to need lots of collaborators at the table, including employers. And it's really going to take an understanding of what it's like to be a mid-career learner, and how we can create career transition paths that really work for learners with all types of lived experience.
Great, Gladys.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things, and I might just start from a very much grounded perspective. What my colleague here shared in terms of the ecosystem of employment service organizations across the country is very true. It's a well-organized system, but it's a well-organized system to provide a very specific set of services. It is not designed to do what you said. It is absolutely not designed to be innovative in any way, shape, or form. And in many cases, we are often at odds with each other around what's innovative and what is non-compliant. We're very quick to point the finger at each other about people doing things that go outside of the scope of what you're traditionally funded for. However, if it takes one funder to come and look at what you're doing and start investing in that opportunity, all of a sudden you are now an innovative practice that everybody else should be following. And so we have a real complexity on our hands in terms of what we've designed, what we need, and what we anticipate we will need in the short and long-term future. But what I am seeing is something I haven't seen in a very long time. I'm not going to date myself and tell you how long I've been working in this sector, but I will say that I think I've done almost every job at an employment service level, from a job developer to a counselor to a supervisor to running different services across various communities. And throughout that time, I have never seen such willingness and openness for academic institutions, industry, and the community service sector to work together as I have in the last 3 to 5 years. It's unusual, it's unique, and I don't know how long it's going to last. But some of the conversations in terms of how you actually advance this work in partnership and in collaboration are still quite exclusive. Not everybody is at the table, and so to John's point in terms of diversity needs to happen at all levels. Who is contributing to the conversation around collaborating in the redesign or re-engineering of services and how they're provided is still quite exclusive. And so there's a lot of opportunity there that I think disruption is presenting, as opposed to the fear of disruption and how it's going to turn everything upside down. That's usually the natural reaction. And the employment world, workforce development world, skills development world is not immune to that. In Ontario right now, there is disruption happening in all kinds of places, but Ontario is not the only province experiencing it. And so we refer to that as disruption, but it stagnates the sector. It causes providers and those who are active in that sector to stop and wait to see what's going to happen before they continue. So there is an automatic and instant disruption to the level of care and service you provide to individuals because you're being directly impacted. And that's something that we really, really have to think about when we talk about innovation and disruption and what opportunities, but also what challenges they present, because it's something we often don't discuss. So in my opinion, there's a real open and willingness to collaborate and to combine resources. I'm finding more and more institutions coming to networks like mine with First Work, a coalition of employment service centers, looking to our network to help them be more agile, to respond in ways that they cannot, and in the time frame that they cannot, and act as an extension of them, which is something we're absolutely open to, but it's an anomaly within the ecosystem in which we operate.
Good point, thank you. So Tom, over to you.
I just want to riff off something that Gladys was saying, and that's a little bit the dichotomy between regulated professions and unregulated professions. We see a bit of a divergence, actually. The freedom of education, the flexibility of education, the combination of seemingly unrelated skill sets is harshly contradicted by accreditation bodies and national bodies that want, or to a degree, of course, also need to impose some kind of standardization. So trades are a very good example. We see right now nationally a big harmonization movement, which sounds very good on the surface. We want to make sure that a Red Seal journey person can actually be educated across the province. There's mobility among the students, and at the same time can be employed in every province. That is on the surface a good thing. What it actually completely contradicts is the idea that individual institutions compete with each other, that individual institutions infuse some creativity in the individual, and what that leads to is basically a meeting at the lowest common denominator, so that everybody can participate. Every college, every institute, every teaching university now is being brought down to a level that uses equipment at the minimum investment, for example. What that leads to eventually is a dumbing down of the workforce and is a dumbing down of the innovation factor that sits in there. And when you look at countries like, let's say, Germany, where the industrial trades have what they call over there a Meister level. It's a master craftsperson. So you do your 4 years apprenticeship, you become a journey person, you work for a while, and then you go to Meister school. And that's where you learn that creativity. The idea of a masterpiece comes from that. I create a masterpiece where my own creativity, my own skill comes to bear, and then I'm being admitted by a panel of my peers into this cadre of masters. It's those Meisters that actually drive the innovation in most companies. We put a wet blanket on that. Our only opportunity that we give to tradespeople is to slide over into the academic world and take a Bachelor of Technology or something like that. That's exactly what it's not supposed to be, because we're not creating the experts in that particular field. And the problem with the regulation now is that a lot of the national accreditation bodies are unfortunately governed by outdated boards, by boards that are crusty in their thinking and that are not willing to go with a new flow. And I get it. I mean, you cannot have everything goes, and your nurse in one province has a completely different skill set than the nurse in the other province. But there is a middle ground between those.
Such a good point. Just picking up on that, can you talk a little bit about some of the innovative practices that are emerging around skills training, credentials, free learning, some of the things that you're doing at BCIT?
Well, our new education plan, which comes out next month, the central the core theme is interdisciplinarity. We're completely paying homage to the idea that new professions emerge at the interface of traditional fields. And both our administrative silos, aka our schools, as well as our faculty, inhibit the creation of new programs, of new skill sets, and so forth. So what we're trying to do is a bunch of things. One is interdisciplinary programs, which includes, in its simplest form, simply includes electives. more electives in there, which then collides with the accreditation body. So there you go. That's not quite as easy as it sounds. But the second one also is interdisciplinary programs as in merging two core professions. And typical example would be digital health, where you have your nurse with a medical background and your data analyst coming together. And then when you look at like the TELUS Babylon project and so forth, the problem that we're having there is, how far out are you thinking? I'm now combining a data analyst with a nurse when I know that in 5 years, an artificial intelligence engine will do the evaluation of the medical data that was just collected from your body last night with your Fitbit and your bathroom that has turned into a diagnostic chamber and so on. So how far do I want to think ahead in order to create that profession? The second one is what we call open multidisciplinary credentials, and that's simply the idea if you take courses at different institutions nowadays, and then we get into the whole issue of badging and micro-credentials and so forth, you have this Appendix A with 50 skills and 50 courses that you've taken, and you have no academic standing whatsoever. And most recruitment processes look only on the cover page. I have a diploma in, I have a degree in, or I have a master's in. So what we're trying to do now is to create an open credential, an open degree where people can bring the credits from different institutions, from different backgrounds, and above all, from non-traditional fields that we infuse through prior learning assessment. We work a lot with the armed forces, with the paramedics, and so forth, where we say, these are skills that have no equivalent in the academic world, and yet they can be translated into some. And the last one is simply interdisciplinary centers of competence, where we say we bring employers and faculty together. Because the problem with work-integrated learning is that our employers aren't ready for that yet. I mean, I cannot chase everybody out and say, well, go to X bank and spend a year there, when nobody at X bank actually knows what to teach. And then they come back and say, well, it was a really great year and I have a job and I made money on the side. Yeah, but now I have nothing to measure it against, right? So this is a bit of a sea change that we have to tackle on a much more comprehensive level. It's not something where we can flip the switch and hooray, the system that we use in Germany for 1,500 years has now just been implemented in Canada overnight. It doesn't work like this. It's a cultural, it's a societal change where you have an intergenerational contract that deals with that issue.
Great. Do others want to add examples? Hot pursuit, Ryan?
Yeah. So I think that's great. I mean, it raises in my mind the question of, why is there a skills gap in the first place? And I don't know the numbers in Canada, but in the US, there are almost 7 million unfilled jobs, and north of 40% of new university graduates are underemployed in their first job. And we've boiled it down to two distinct frictions that exist in the labor market. The first is education friction. It explains why tens of millions of people don't just go out and get upskilled, and it's the time to upskill, the cost of upskilling, and the uncertainty of a employment outcome. If you could wave a magic wand and eliminate all those, you'd have lots of upskilling going on in the economy. But that's not the only friction. There's also friction on the employer side, which we call hiring friction. And that's the reduced propensity of employers today to hire someone for a role where that candidate literally hasn't done that job before. And that's a natural response to increased churn at the entry level, as well as the increased cost of a bad hire. But hiring friction is a real problem. And it's becoming worse. So we look at solutions as we think about solutions broadly for better aligning our educational ecosystem with what employers are seeking. We look at solutions that are actually do something about hiring friction. And so to your point about sort of integrating work experience into courses, there's a Canadian company called Ryerson. You might be aware of that's doing a great job of creating a marketplace where employers can actually put real projects they need done, or test projects, and faculty are on the other side at institutions, and they can integrate these work projects into their coursework and give hundreds or thousands of students actual work experience and expose them to employers, and that definitely reduces hiring friction for employers. So,
it's interesting because I don't know if you know, but the government of Canada has invested a massive amount of money in work-integrated learning precisely to address that, but there are still some issues. Gladys, any innovative examples you'd want to talk about, either in your organization or others you work with?
Sure. So just to kind of piggyback off of what my colleague was saying regarding the hiring friction, one of the things that we've been actively trying to test is how to best leverage the existing services to address hiring friction issues with a variety of employers. And through that work, we've been looking at what types of interventions are best suited to various types of working environments with vulnerable populations. So we know that the more challenges there are in the economy, the most vulnerable become increasingly vulnerable. They don't become more competitive in that space. So you still have the individuals who always needed help needing even more help because they're that much further away from opportunity. And that includes looking at things like, if this is the set of criteria that you use to create opportunities for young people, what if we don't look at that criteria at all? And what if we start looking at capabilities and aptitudes, willingness, availability, and interest as indicators and as the criteria for selection? Very challenging process when you take that approach and try to implement it in a very structured environment that has a mandate which is well-intentioned. Someone has come up with an idea that our company is going to invest in young people and we're going to create, 1,000 jobs over 10 years or 1,000 jobs over 5 years, which is great and we all celebrate it. But then the people who actually need to implement that opportunity are still using their screening method, they're still using the same sort of application forms. And so working with them to adjust that criteria, the manner in which it gets applied, how you interview, how you screen, how you onboard, has been really, really interesting. And doing that within the context of the existing funded ecosystem is really, really important because all of these things that are happening outside of it are very difficult to sustain. When we inject a lot of money to test things out, but we don't take the additional time to figure out how this gets integrated into ongoing service delivery, we're exacerbating our problem over and over and over again. Because we can do it for a few years. We have all these people that come out with these great things, but then you go back to the traditional way of the way that you've always done things. And so partnerships between government, the private sector, and community services being tested in Ontario, Quebec, and in Ottawa have been really interesting, and we've played an active part there. And the other place where we're playing a role is we've recently formed something called the Council for Youth Prosperity, which is a national coalition bringing together quite a few partners that are contributing to the employment ecosystem in ways that we find disruptive, ways that they find innovative, but ways that the community service sector and government, for that matter, finds quite disruptive and problematic. And trying to bring those parties together to figure out how these initiatives can better work together so that we create more seamless opportunities for job seekers, including workers, maybe those individuals that are underemployed or individuals that are at the threat of losing their jobs and not waiting for them to become unemployed before they have access to services. And that's been another really interesting area to watch. Our challenge, as always, is being able to scale. These types of initiatives are ones that are often funded through one-off, research projects or one-off evaluation projects, sharing that information with those who have the power to make sure that they are integrated practices and that there is flexibility for providers to choose to deliver services in this way is a fundamental challenge.
Thanks so much. Maybe, Karen, this is a good place to ask you. There's lots of activity right now in the future skills space. And based on your background in evaluation and research, can you talk a little bit about how we can better understand what works and what doesn't work? And also, how relevant are the international examples? We hear a lot about the Fraunhofers in Germany or things that Nest is doing or others around the world. Can you maybe start us off?
Sure. So I would say first and foremost, when we think about training and what the evidence is related to training, we need to be really clear that skills training, human capital investment, it's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea. This point was made really well by Sunil in the panel. It's also been really well put by the Aspen Institute, especially when we're talking about individuals who have been historically disadvantaged or economically vulnerable. So we want to be really mindful of what training can do and where we need other types of social and labor market policies. So that's the first point. Second point, there is about 30 plus years of evidence around what works with training. And for any of you who've tried to slog through that evidence, to put it really concisely, the evidence is mixed. And so you've probably seen some people stand up and say, training doesn't work. There's been lots of rigorous evaluations and the results have been pretty disappointing. You've probably heard other people stand up and say that, that there's lots of effective training models. And really both are true. And what it comes down to is context and quality. Right, as if you do some meta-analysis of this literature and really look at, what were the places and conditions under which interventions had positive results, and when did they have negative results? And some of the emerging themes are probably exactly what you would expect, right? That the training alignment with employer and labor market needs more broadly, that is, of course, the most important criteria. You need to be training for actual in-demand jobs in the labor market. Instructional design quality matters, the delivery matters. And practitioners have really, over the last decade or so, really taken the lessons from these early evaluation results. And we're seeing lots of really innovative models that pick up on these elements that are evidence-informed practice. One approach in the US that started locally and actually has been replicated widely across the US and is starting to be scaled up by states as well as incorporated institutionally into federal policy is the career pathways approach. And it's an approach that brings together multiple players in the ecosystem, employers, higher ed, workforce development providers, and really puts the learner at the center. It's an approach that is really geared towards individuals who are already working, helping them combine work and learning. It's stackable credentials with multiple entry points so that people don't have to start on the beginning. It builds on prior learning, prior experience, multiple exit points so that people can take the shortest amount that's going to get them to where they want to be in the labor market, but also allows them to come back and build progressively on their experience. So it's not a one and done, it's an integrated and seamless approach. It also has learner supports to help guide learners through that education experience. Undergoing rigorous evaluation right now, a number of large-scale evaluations in the US. Preliminary results are quite positive. I also want to just highlight one intervention that I think might be of interest to people in the room, and this is Year Up. It's another US model that has been running for over a decade and is now part of a rigorous evaluation with really quite striking results. So it's targeted towards 18 to 24-year-olds, and it is for historically disadvantaged, vulnerable youth. The focus is the IT or financial services sector. It's about 6 months of customized training in these areas, and then followed up by a 6-month work placement. And interestingly, the work placement part, the costs of that work placement, because learners are of course paid for this placement, is about 60% picked up by employers. So it's an example of everyone having some skin in the game. And the 18-month results, so 6 months after the internship finishes, for program individuals who participated in the program, they're earning about $2,000 more a quarter, so that would translate to about $8,000 more a year than individuals who didn't participate in the program. And it's been evaluated using a random control trial design, so gold standard in evaluation. So this is a really striking example, and in fact, it's this program has produced the largest impact of any workforce development program that has been evaluated through the random control trial design in the US. So it's something I think we really should be paying attention to in Canada as we're starting to think about youth and work integrated learning. And this, the last point that I would say about that is I think if we were to look at what is the secret sauce of that program, I think training, not just for the technical skill, but also the mindset and the capability. And as we heard this morning about really that importance of really redefining what learning is and thinking a little more broadly than technical skills.
Yeah, there are lots of great examples in Canada. I mean, Gladys and I are both on the board of Empower, which is a very similar model. But
Yeah,
others
absolutely.
want to, I'm very conscious of the time, and we actually have some questions from the audience. But any other points on evaluation?
Europe is obviously a very successful example, although it's taken a decade to scale to where it is today. But more broadly speaking, these pathways scale fastest when they minimize or eliminate the education friction for the candidate and the hiring friction for the employer. So Europe basically does both of those. It's an employer down, and so we differentiate between what we call education up approaches, which is everything that we've known to date, which is a bunch of well-meaning people like this sit around a table, ascertain what skills are missing, develop a curriculum, recruit students, deliver that curriculum, graduate students, and then hope and pray they find work, versus an employer down approach, where you have typically an intermediary, like a year up, that starts with the employers, ascertains what employers are looking for, and then essentially absorbs the frictions into itself, recruits the candidates, invests in them, trains them, and then essentially staffs them out to the employers on a try before you buy basis. That strategy has basically informed everything that we as a firm are doing now. We are building scalable employer pay models, and we know from experience they can scale to the tens of thousands annually very quickly. And America very much needs them, probably more than Canada does at this point. But I think these are models that are starting in the U.S. because the U.S. is suffering most from these crises of college completion, college affordability, and employability on the other side. But they will go global.
I wanted to give Gladys a chance either to jump in on this or maybe lead us off in the last question, and it really riffs off some of this. We talked about the employer-centric approaches, but we also talked about vulnerable populations, and some of the leading programs that are being exported from the States have been very targeted at marginalized populations and those farthest from the workforce. I don't know, Gladys, did you want to make any comments about either the evaluation process or kick us off on our last formal question before we go off to Slido?
So I will add to that, and it might lead into one of those questions as I look at them, the pink one as well. So I think one of the things that we learn from external examples, and some of them being shared here today, but also one of my colleagues shared around what's happening in Germany, and we look at international examples, there are specific types of intermediaries that are active, that are industry focused, that are working closely with employers, and we don't have a lot of those here. We just don't have that type of service as core to our ecosystem. When we do have them, we're in awe of how they operated, how they founded. Empower is a perfect example of that, where it came out not as a traditional provider, that it was very industry specific. It holds its, hangs its hat on its ability to meet the needs of employers at a very specific level within that industry, but a wide variety of employers that play in that space. That is not part of our traditional structure, but it should be. Can it be replicated exactly the way it's produced in other international environments? In my personal opinion, no. We don't have the political infrastructure to support that. When we have an election, everything changes. It's very, very difficult to sustain services through changes in political ideology. In some countries, there are safeguards in place. And when we look at infrastructure and ecosystem structure, there are elements in place to help minimize, it won't completely eradicate it, but minimize the disruption to core services. And we don't have that as part of our structure here right now, nor is it something that we actively pay attention to. So I think it is challenging. There are great examples, and if we can figure out how to better invest and integrate those examples so they do become core intermediaries of a variety of sort, meeting the needs of a variety of sectors, that would be a great thing that I think everyone would benefit from. And if I jump into that around how well, if governments were to develop policy to facilitate that or to allow that to happen, how well would organizations be able to respond? I think it would be very difficult for many organizations in the traditional setting to respond, because that is not their expertise. It is not the way that they've been operating for a very, very long time. And so I do think that it would be challenging, and it's a challenge that we are actually anticipating and trying to work through in Ontario right now. It's a challenge that's already been experienced out in BC with the transformation to their employment ecosystem. But it's also a challenge that forces private sector and public sector to work much closer together. And if we invest in building an infrastructure where those two elements can function better to contribute to the ecosystem, we'll all be better for it. But at this point, it is not part of our core operating system.
The other thing I just wanted to add to that, which is pertinent to some of the examples that have been mentioned, is a lot of the very successful models in the US, and in fact even in Power in Canada in its early stages, relied on philanthropic donations rather than government. And the tradition in the US of private sector investments in the whole ecosystem is very different than what we see in Canada, where it's expected that government will step up. We are out of time, but just out of deference to the audience, anybody want to react to the first question, which got the most votes, about the new Canada training benefit, or should we just say, no, we can't answer, we're out of time?
I can certainly take a stab on it. The Canada training benefit it's a great example how we're trying to enable access, but the question is, what are we enabling access to? So it is I think you mentioned that as well, it's a political, often short-term solution to a perceived problem. The lifelong learning element that it's partially trying to address, in my opinion, would be much better combated with, and Karen, you mentioned that very briefly, is with a systemic change. Like, for example, progressive credentials, where somebody can go to a university or a polytechnic for a year and get a certificate, then go to work, earn money, and come back and take the second year and come into a diploma and then a degree. We don't do that. In BC, we have what's called the BC Council for Admissions and Transfer, where we have that system of transfer credits, but it's not properly stacked yet either. And so we're giving money to students, but we still force them into this monolithic education approach. The flexibility is not there on the other end to meet the sponsorship on the front end.
I'm going to have to leave it at that because I just saw it of the corner of my eye. My keeper is here. Thanks very much. Big round of applause for the panel.